I've seen a lot of people who are in this space of like, glute building, come up with variations that are unique. And I mean, which one do you want to start with? Like, I know we can go chronological, but these are these are goofy. Is that an appropriate word? Maybe they're not
It's
goofy.
everything that you'll see that people have a cult like attachment to is because there's some, may it be evidence or may it be perceived evidence that it works, right? So let's start with the leaning back abductions, machine abductions, because we're just talking about abductions right now, anyways.
There we go.
So
Yeah.
let's take regional hypertrophy. Nice fan shaped muscle. I was going to say like the pec. Let's use the glute because the glute is the topic and the glute is a fan shaped muscle, meaning it has a certain amount of attachment points, but it fans out. It's nice and circular. So all those individual muscle fibers are going to splay off into unique directions over the course of the entire like hip. It's going to then therefore serve a few different purposes. The major is hip extension. So think your hip going from flexed to extended like an RDL. There's going to do some external rotation and some abduction, hence the abduction machine, and sometimes a little bit of kickback motion with external rotation as well. Like those are ways to contract or target very specific muscle fibers. However, generally speaking, there's a full recruitment of all the fibers in various degrees in just training real hard. Now, exercises like your glute med, or for your glute med rather, like a seated abduction machine versus the standing cable kickback that we discussed, that starts to draw in a little bit of an ability to emphasize these slightly more, I would argue it's better for individual anthropometry. So like my stature and structure versus Corey's, doing a standing cable abduction is probably better for both of us to hit our individual structure or hit our glute meds given our individual structure than hoping that the machine in its blunt object format, just through sending it through absolute effort, will give us the same direct stimulus. Okay, there's rationale there. Well, let's take that regional perspective of like these very small muscle being the glute med, but then the very smallest like strand of lining up those fibers with a very specific resistance. Let's just lean back. Let's get into essentially as much hip extension as possible and then do our knees out machine. I mean, the argument could be made that, yeah, you're getting a more direct line of force through those very select muscle fibers. But the extent to which you are then probably underloading it or reducing its progressibility, like long term, just to get a very strong sensation in a very small spot, plus circling in what I was saying about the amount of time and effort it takes from a regional perspective to see individualized growth in certain areas relative to just doing, say, a major compound or a larger version of the exercise that accounts for more muscle mass, it becomes almost, not almost, this is the major pushback against most things. There's a nugget of truth where it's like, maybe it works. But then when you think on the practical applicability side, the return on investment side in a real program for a long-term client looking to get stage ready, the time, effort, fatigue, minimal for these things, but not non-existent. But the return on investment is maybe I have to now add this into my program for the extended foreseeable future to see maybe there's too many maybes, maybe some result. Like, no, let's just not do that. Let's just do the custom built cable abduction machine for my specific structure.
I think that's where it's really important to, I would say, go into your training with goals around, hey, I want my training to make sense. If you don't have that as a goal, if that's something for you that you're like, you know what, I'm okay with the ambiguity. I'm okay with doing this exercise for months on end, knowing that it might not be paying off in a return standpoint nearly as much as several alternatives. Well, then by all means, like if that's what your goal is, but typically, whenever I have someone want to move away from, let's say, traditional machine abduction, and for listeners, for people who are not watching the video, who are not going to put themselves in really like it's not a bridged position, is it? But I mean, like, I know there's the snow angel version of it that, requires a very fancy machine. And then there's the DIY get up into the glute bridge position and then do the abduction machine. Goofy. I don't think it's necessary. Unless you're someone if you just want to have that, in your program and give it your best go, it's just, the reality is there are better options that um, you'll be able to continue to progress in systematically. So I think you closed that one really well. I think that kind of leads into the standing glute med exercise, which for listeners, for those who are not watching the video, putting the plate or dumbbell in your working leg, having some kind of, is it, say, ipsilateral support, with, so your opposing hand, is that, did I fuck that up, or
No, you're on point.
okay.
Um,
Yeah,
I
let's standing glute med thing movement.
it's no, it's not like okay. Again, it's taking the kernel of, remember what I said way at the beginning, where I was like, let's not demonize certain exercises like the hip thrust. Period. Like the hip thrust, yeah, go team. Because if you put tension across fibers, if you load a range of motion where a muscle fiber is contracting against resistance, something should happen. However, again, it comes down to what is the ROI for the setup, execution, stability demands, and then overall, is there something that's way more easy on all those fronts and progressible and loadable and something that's more efficacious, more in general for your time? So we're essentially doing, this is why this one confused me so much, because until I listened to the audio, I was like, oh, it's the opposite leg. It was like, this is a standing clamshell for some reason. Okay. Oh, instead of it being the leg that's doing the most movement, it's the stance leg that they're standing on that is the target for glute med work. Well, the range of motion on the glute med in that respect and the conflicting demands on stability versus force production, even though you're holding on to something, those are all in massive conflict with just get the thing to failure. Again, I want everybody to walk away today being like, okay, if I just sit on a leg press and have a nosebleed and I can no longer push this sled with my quads, glutes, adductors, or anything else that might be at play here, that's like the holy grail of mechanical tension and like stimulus on a set, right? It's very hard to replicate that with most exercises, but like, let's aim for it. Let's slowly progress our physical abilities to be able to do that. I just nuked my entire laptop setup. One sec. There we go. I'm
You're
back.
good.
So we add in whatever we'll call this exercise, standing clamshell, standing abduction, whatever. Let's put ourselves on one foot. Let's put a plate on the opposite leg. Let's raise that up such that we do almost like a miniature hip airplane from a standing position with a very small range of motion. So we're checking the box. If we have quality control measures for growth or for stimulus, we have loaded a tissue. There is resistance, albeit the resistance is probably in a profile that makes no sense, meaning that it's hard or easy in seemingly random places relative to where you are strong or weak. And overall, its ability to be progressed long-term, and truly be like proximity to failure for just a muscular contraction against resistance, as opposed to stability or anything else, really. It's just, what are we doing? Truly, like it, you've said it before, I will co-sign. If people like novelty and it somehow inserts into their goal that may not be from a competitive standpoint, neat. I personally am all about novelty. I do a lot of shit for clients that will keep them adherent and enjoy the process. But it usually makes a little bit more sense on the grand scheme of their programming than something like this. Because if we now speak more directly to your audience broadly, granted, you have everybody, but we're speaking more in a competitive setting right now. The degree of effort that this would take for the ROI, which is almost zero, that makes a difference when you're trying to get a pro card or when you're trying to get like ultra competitive. So something like this, this is the plank for your abdominal development if you're trying to get a six pack versus the glute med in this example. Like, sure, you're utilizing the musculature, but if you're trying to get a six pack, probably load your abdominals. Like, do crunches against resistance for progressive overload, as opposed to just hold a timed isometric for a while. Maybe if you're trying to grow the glute med, have progressive overload means like load or sets or reps, get close to failure, have a range of motion that's more than 1 inch and doesn't have a tremendous amount of stability demands to even accomplish that. It's just too many moving parts. It goes back to what we're talking about regarding what is the interference with you getting to an actual appreciable level of stimulus. There's too many things interfering with that. If people are willing to demonize, say, a back squat for glute growth because there's too much skill involved or there's too many synergists, this might have less synergists for the glute med, but there's a tremendous amount of interference from someone executing it well enough for long enough with enough load or adequate stimulus to really see the return that they would want, in my opinion.
I'm with you, and I think there's a high probability of losing that position, which ultimately, if that's kind of what we set the tone with at the beginning of the episode, is if you are looking to get more out of these movements and if you're able to progress them throughout your phase, the positioning is going to be the thing I would really focus on early on, prior to just sending it. This might be something that maybe you do feel, but from a repeatability standpoint, what is that really going to look like? And then there's the aspect of, okay, consistently progressing up the weight. Okay, you're holding a 45-pound plate against your non-working leg in this movement. How much of that weight are you taking off just simply by gravity? Yes. At that point, I mean, we're looking at the range of motion, the return, now the load requirements to produce that stimulus. I just see that runway also being very short. So, to each is their own. If you want to do this, it works for you. That's okay. Okay. Is this, standardized? Is this the way that we should go about growing our glute meds? I wouldn't say so. Smith
So you
machine.
raise actually a
Oh,
very important point that might be a very good point for people to have as a frame of reference as to why, even beyond what we've already talked about. So something like the 45-degree hip extension that we talked about at the top of the discussion has a very shallow ceiling of progressibility, at least through load, because of the position and the, like, what are you gonna, like, there's some people that are psychopaths, they'll put a barbell on their back. I'm like, well, that's a issue, or try to do a deadlift with it. I mean, I've seen that before, and like, shout out, I guess, Pete Rubish for those that are as old as I am, I guess. But the reality is, it's got a very narrow ceiling, very low ceiling rather, of loadability, hence in a lot of ways progressibility. So it finds itself either as a warm up tool, pump up the glutes, get better proprioception for the real exercises that are going to be the meat and potatoes, or it's an adequate finishing exercise that hits the shortened glute, because by that point you're already pre-exhausted by what? The main exercises of the day that actually have progressive overload means that will keep them being stimulating for eternity. Your squat patterns, your hinge patterns, your split squats, your whatever else. Those can be progressed day over day, session over session, week over week, year over year, et cetera, where the degree of fatigue you incur for the stimulation gets you to the point where at the end of your workout, your 45-degree hip extension that is still very underloaded, relatively speaking, can still give you some sort of top-off stimulation, because it's literally supposed to be the cherry on top. Compare and contrast to that concept for an underloaded exercise or a non-progressible exercise like the 45-degree hip extension for glute max, relative to our standing plate abduction thingy. What would be the squat in this analogy for that? Well, that would be like a machine or a cable hip abduction, most likely. Well, those are already underloaded variations that are very precision in what you're trying to accomplish. So we're stacking low runway of progressibility, very, very, very precise, with something that's even more so. So we're just taking time within a workout, energy, fatigability, recoverability, albeit minor because they are such small movements, and we're just stacking them for next to no ROI because there was no big meat and potatoes exercise prior to them that could make it so that they had renewed benefit.